Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Anne, both for an update. I think it was very helpful to get the comments from the participants here about some of the concerns. And we do encourage you also to use eDesiderata, our online space for aggregating member interest and comments, to put some of those additional questions out there. We encourage individuals at member institutions to log in with their standard CRL username and password, and to even go into the portion of eDesiderata called Me Desiderata, where you can set up watch lists for particular products or particular types of offers that are coming out, whether it's through a particular subject or a format of something, so that you get alerted to when comments are made or when there are updates to the reviews or when we post comments about the license. It's a great way to stay up to date in live time as to what's going on within our particular product licensing offers. Moving on to the second phase of our update on digitization, and I will be presenting on the growing impact of CRL's demand scanning. As most members know, CRL for the past decade plus now has been engaged in digitization from its collections in response to patron interest from member institutions. That is, when we receive interlibrary loan requests or requests for access to materials, CRL has implemented a process by which it can evaluate the capacity for CRL to scan that material and to deliver it electronically as opposed to physical interlibrary loan. This process has been in place for quite some time. We provide our materials in digital format where possible in order to improve access to those essential primary sources. And we make those materials available to all CRL members after the first scan by hosting them on CRL's digital delivery service. I'd like to just talk a little bit about that, to peek behind the curtain, to show the growing impact of CRL's demand digitization activities, especially as it relates to collaborative or other strategic scanning initiatives that CRL puts in place. So this is a bit of a wonks tour behind our digital delivery, because I rely very heavily on charts and statistics here, so bear with me. I will, however, start with a slight palette cleanser and just highlight two of the frequently downloaded materials from CRL's digital delivery server. These two monographs, which were scanned 4 or 5 years ago, represent some of the varied types of materials that CRL presents to its member institutions. The one on the left, entitled "Struggle" by Dr. Emanuel Lasker, is a book that was published in 1907. Dr. Lasker was a German chess player, mathematician, and philosopher who was in fact the world chess champion from 1894 to 1921. Whereas one of his most famous books was on the manual of chess, his publication called Kampf, or Struggle, sought to create, sought to bring together his thoughts on philosophy as well as mathematics and chess to create a general theory of competitive activities, including not just chess, but things such as business. And he was a contemporary of Einstein, and they engaged in frequent conversations. So this book is quite an interesting read, I would say. On the right-hand side represents one of the materials that is available only to CRL member institutions, because it was published in 1928 by a Prussian pioneer in the field of public relations. His book, called Propaganda, was one of the early efforts to help define and theorize the field of public relations. In his introduction to the book, he says, "It's the purpose of this book to explain the structure of the mechanism which controls the public mind, and to tell how it's manipulated by the special pleader who seeks to create public acceptance for a particular idea or commodity." That's a fascinating read, and I do commend it to you on your ride home, even though it's not a podcast yet. So, bringing you back around to the statistics. As I mentioned at the beginning, CRL's work in digitization has spanned over 12 years at this point. And although we started slow, working with our members in this. You can see through this chart the cumulative aggregation of materials that CRL now makes available to its member institutions. The purple area on the bottom represents the number of pages that CRL hosts locally in its digital delivery service that were scanned directly in relation to patron requests, so on-demand scanning there. Stacked on top of that are the materials that we have that we host through collaborative scanning. Here I refer to it as strategic to differentiate it between the on-demand activities. And you can see here the steady accumulation of that as well, which took off somewhat radically in 2015. That was when CRL began to ingest a number of the files and other resources that we scanned in partnership with institutions like LLMC and Redex. So those pages, in terms of strategic scanning, have now encompassed more than 18 million pages, as you can see here. But the CRL on-demand scanning currently represents more than 7.5 million pages and growing. We tend to scan around 4 million pages per year total through CRL's partnerships and on-demand scanning, and augmenting that through the digitization activities with partnerships and special programs external to CRL. Cumulatively, CRL offers more than 40 million pages to all CRL members as part of its digital services. This pie chart represents just a glimpse at how the page count within DDS is allocated to specific types of materials. Here you can see the number of pages coming from serials represents the largest amount of materials within the digital delivery service, often because that represents large volumes of materials. When we scan materials, we try to scan it at the unit level. So materials that are requested will scan an entire issue or an entire volume as the case may merit. But the other representative collections in here include the news pages, the government documents like the ministerial reports and other materials, our monographic collections and dissertations, and a very small percentage of materials that I grouped into special collections. These include things like the microform guides and the Civilian Conservation Corps camp papers. When you look at the use of the materials from CRL's digital delivery, it more or less corresponds to the size of the collections within the DDS that we host. There's a slight growth in terms of the percentage of use of the monograph collection as opposed to the serials collection. But news, dissertations, and government documents all more or less sort of represent ongoing use of those materials based on what we've already scanned. The special collections see a growth here, particularly on the reliance of those microform guides as an access mechanism to the deeper collections of CRL. All things told, over 1.4 million items out of CRL's digital delivery service have been downloaded since 2006. That includes more than 500,000 serial issues, 380,000 monographs, 120,000 dissertations, and over 170,000 issues of news as they go. So this material continues to be relied on very heavily and growing based on the members' increased access to this material. I promised to talk more about the on-demand scanning as the principal focus of this, and I just wanted to bring this chart out to demonstrate or perhaps suggest that CRL's on-demand strategy yields ongoing use of our collections in ways that we did not necessarily expect over time. This chart, in which the on-demand dots, which are on top, suggests that the number of times the on-demand materials are downloaded are usually far and away greater than the number of times things that we scanned on our strategic base. I know that sounds a little bit twisted, but generally speaking, we can say at every level, the on-demand material gets more use than the materials that we have scanned in anticipation of use. So that proves the value of the service on behalf of the members, because once it's scanned, it's often accessed multiple times by that institution and other member institutions as well. even as it evens out towards the 30 to 50 downloads for any given title, the on-demand still stays slightly higher, evenly so, than the materials that were scanned on strategic basis. Another way to look at this chart, just briefly, breaking out the types of materials that have been used more than 50 times, that is, they've been downloaded over 50 times through CRL's collections. And some of our material has been downloaded tens of thousands of times, I have to say. But just generally speaking, when titles get used more than 50 times, we would count that as a high circulating item. The percentages you see at the bottom suggest, again, that the demand titles see more use in general than the materials that we've scanned just on speculation or in collaboration with other institutions. So you can see the news, for example, on the left side, whereas 244 titles have been accessed more than 50 times. That represents almost half of all of the news that we've scanned on demand. So almost half of that collection sees multiple use over and over and over again, more than 50 times. So we are seeing this, and we are very encouraged, I think, by the response to these materials. Some exceptions to that rule, as one might see scrying through this chart, includes the dissertations here, where the strategic titles have seen as a percentage more use than the materials we've scanned on demand. The dissertation collection, of course, is fairly eclectic and diverse, and so those materials don't necessarily see a huge amount of use over time. The materials that have seen frequent use included the dissertations that CRL scanned from its Nobel laureate collection of dissertations. So Einstein's dissertation has seen multiple downloads from CRL's collections, for instance. That's accounting for that relative change. Moving away from the charts for just a bit, I wanted to provide some more examples of the types of use that we're seeing from the collections, and in particular from the materials that we're scanning from patron requests. The things that we see frequent use include the foreign newspaper collection, and here are just two examples of materials. The one on the left, Al-Madina, is an Urdu biweekly newspaper that was published in Bijnor, India, and it was one of the most prominent Muslim newspapers in the UP, and played a significant role in shaping Muslim public opinion in the region. This is a relatively recent scan, and it's jumped toward the top of the most frequently used foreign newspapers that CRL has. So there is evidence that these materials, particularly in vernacular languages, are important to the scholars. The one on the right, of course, is the Gazeta de la Habana, which is the paper of record for the colonial government in Cuba. Some of this material was initially scanned on demand. The reason that this is in such fine color scans here was because LAMP and LARP, our two Latin American collaborative programs, picked up this title and scanned additional materials from different collections, including bound volumes at the University of Miami, thanks to the funding of LAMP and LARP. Other materials that get use, of course, include CRL's domestic newspapers and the materials from the ethnic communities around the United States. And here are two examples of titles for which CRL has scanned portions of these titles, and they see a lot of use. So we continue to add and augment the availability of these materials as additional faculty and students request those materials. They include the first Polish daily Catholic paper in America, the Dziennik Chicagowski, Go Chicago, and the Irish American from New York, which was a weekly published from 1849 to 1915. You can see the dense text on this paper, that it gets used so much. People must be really saints to want to pour through that title. Other materials that have been the subject of primary source scrutiny in and of themselves include titles such as the Dearborn Independent, which is technically a domestic newspaper that was produced and published by Henry Ford though it was established in 1901. Henry Ford used it as a mouthpiece for his views and his organization's companies there in Michigan from about 1919 through 1927. This title itself was controversial because of the anti-Semitic views that were frequently published in the publication itself, which ultimately caused the demise of the newspaper itself to cease publishing after lawsuits regarding that content was put out there. Finally, one of CRL's most frequently downloaded serials ever includes The Truth Seeker. Some of you may be familiar with this resource. It's a periodical that began publishing in 1873, and it's considered one of the most influential free thought publications throughout the 20th century. Though there were other periodicals, The Truth Seeker was one or the only one with national circulation. So this saw a lot of people accessing this. The free thought movement sort of saw its golden age in the first few decades of the 20th century. This publication technically is still producing, and it is available online. They have also published some of their early issues on their own website, but CRLs continue to see ongoing download month after month. So we're pretty interested in those who are making use of this material as well. Just wanted to throw up a couple more examples from our dissertation collections to show some of the resources that continue to get cited over and over again and downloaded from CRL's collections. These include one of the first early clinical studies of the harmful effects of tobacco. This was published in Paris in the early 1900s. And has been cited multiple times in historical studies through the tobacco use. Another one that has seen frequent use, which is just slightly older, includes the dissertation called The Dragon in China and Japan. This was published in English, though the sinologist was actually from, I believe, the Netherlands in publishing this. This dissertation continues to see high downloads from our materials as well. Finally, I did want to just mention that CRL, beyond the books and serials, does scan materials from its archival collections. And these do see frequent and high use from among our member institutions. A number of these collections are accessible only to member institutions. So we see that the high volume download of these materials as validation of CRL's approach towards scanning microfilm archives and other materials from our collections that can help support primary source research and instruction. The one at the top, Records of the Department of State relating to the Internal Affairs of Mexico, is a NARA publication, and it runs some 200 reels long. CRL has scanned only a portion of its collection, but is endeavoring to scan a much larger segment of this collection in response to the high use that we're seeing from the members themselves. Other materials include collections from the German Foreign Ministry archives and the records of German military operations, including those from the German army areas here. And we see a lot of use of the historical documentation of the declassified resources coming out of the Manhattan Project surrounding the atomic bomb. So these are just some samples of the types of materials that are available to your patrons and are seeing high use in CRL's collections. I want to turn just briefly to talk a little bit about CRL's open access collections. As members will recall, at the 2016 Council of Voting Members meeting, CRL put the question to the membership regarding whether more CRL digital resources should be made open access. A lot of the restrictions that we had in place at that time were based on the perception among the CRL membership that resources that were being digitized by CRL for CRL members was a tangible benefit of that membership, and that much of that material should be made accessible only to CRL members. Well, CRL was delighted to hear the comments from the member institutions relating to this, at which they highly recommended that should the material be found to be in the public domain, CRL should not seek to put any additional barriers of access to those materials. So as of January 1, 2017, all digital materials that CRL was putting up on its digital delivery services that derived from materials in the public domain would be made openly accessible to the world. So you can see in this chart that over 2/3 of our collection is now open access and available to individuals, independent researchers, and non-member institutions as well. 33% of that collection still are accessible only to members of CRL, relating, of course, due to the reasons of copyright or uncertainty of the status of that copyright. So those materials, especially later materials, are accessible only to CRL member institutions. And you can see the use bearing out of these materials, where the public, the total, I would call it here, the total accesses represents those beyond just member access, has been growing steadily over the years. So the green line at the bottom, the member numbers, represents those materials that are accessed by all CRL member institutions. And you can see the number of uses, and that's items downloaded per year, or per quarter in this case. The number of items downloaded by the members is steady and growing in terms of the access by the member institutions. Whereas access to the open access materials by non-member institutions continues to grow and radically grew in the past couple of quarters, in part due to two major initiatives that CRL has accomplished through the Global Collections Initiative. Number one was putting up the files from the Mexican intelligence services under our Project Midas, which we covered in one of our webinars not too long ago. And the other one was bringing in and reprocessing the Brazilian government documents digital archives that CRL initially hosted in the early 2000s as a standalone and image-only collection. CRL took the entirety of the 700,000 plus pages of that materials, reprocessed them for OCR, put them up through CRL's DDS Next platform, and released that information out to the public. The Brazil collection has long been a highly sought after and highly used collection from CRL, but not until this year was it brought into CRL's digital delivery server. So we didn't have accurate statistics to track how much use of that collection was being made by members and by institutions outside of the CRL membership. In fact, the most use of that material is made by researchers in Brazil itself. So you can see the numbers scaling up quickly as in a response to that material that has been that was just recently re-hosted on CRL's digital delivery servers. Just briefly, wanted to pay mention and cite as examples some of the high-use institutions for CRL's digital collections. Here you can see the, I believe, top 15 institutions, and these were institutions that have downloaded more than 5,000 items through their use of CRL's collections. And those include some of the top research institutions, but also a number of institutions that have made great use of CRL's collections, primarily through the loading of CRL's electronic resource records into their local catalog. That's one of the benefits we've routinely highlighted as one of the best ways to make use of CRL's collections. And this chart will maybe a little small on your screen, I hope it's not too small, bears out some of that value of loading the records and the use of the materials. You can see here over the course of 3 fiscal years, we performed a study of the number of downloads for institutions that fall into Carnegie classification ranges like high-intensity research institutions, those that are on the less research-intensive or master's programs, as well as for Canadian institutions who wisely don't follow the Carnegie classification. When we averaged those out, we saw those institutions that did load our records into their catalog, on average, saw more than 2 to 3 times use of CRL's electronic resource collections than those who did not load CRL's records. So those resources bared out across all of the levels that we studied. The Canadian institutions represent an interesting trend in that recently, Canadian institutions have been paying more attention in surfacing CRL's records through their discovery systems. So even if they haven't loaded the records, they've figured out ways that they can bring those records up into the search results so that their patrons could access those materials. So we're seeing interesting developments in Canada, and we'd be happy to talk more about that with you if you're interested in learning more about how to load CRL's records. That's what I wanted to cover. I hope that this has given you some insight into CRL's overall approach to scanning on demand, as well as lining up our materials on our digital delivery services. I'd be happy to take questions or comments from any of you that may have them at this point. One member who put a question in during registration, or more of a comment, mentioned that they saw great value in exploring with CRL the opportunities to scan materials in advance of a course that was teaching using primary source materials. One faculty member was in fact looking for approximately 10 years of a newspaper for their students to use, so they contacted CRL to see whether we could put those materials up and effectively put them on, quote, reserve for the students' use in that classroom setting. That's something that we very much welcome. We'd like to learn more about how your patrons are making use of CRL's resources in terms of research, instruction, and other practices as well on campus. We have a member who commented that thank you for the examples, and related to the chess approaches here and the chess philosophy, can we correlate between the high level of scanning requests and further negotiation efforts, for example, in the newspaper domain? Yes, that's a great question. It's a great area for exploration. CRL has seen over 500 newspaper titles requested on demand from our collections. And so we've exceeded 500 newspaper titles scanned on demand for patrons at institutions. So we can see proof of interest in that materials, and not just because that's the only because that's one of the things we highlight most, but we've heard that time and again from our member representatives that these resources are of interest. And that's why we began the explorations of ways that we can strategically scan more of those materials on behalf of the member institutions. So internally, when we see evidence of use in-house, we'll often queue those titles in for ongoing or strategic scanning to help fill in gaps, for instance, between ranges of the newspapers that we have, or areas where we've scanned materials in partnership with an organization like REDX through the World Newspaper Archive, seeking to extend access beyond the limits of that program into further years to further support the use by member institutions. We've also seen that as evidence of growth within those archival collections, and we've been, in a previous update, we highlighted the CRL's Global Collections platform as an area where we can begin to surface those ideas of collections of interest for the members, where we can proceed to work further in our own digitization, as well as through discussions with other institutions as ways to potentially license or push for open access collections to be made available through other institutions. Just one comment here about the availability of CRL's records. One of our members said they have activated CRL's content through records in ProQuest 360, otherwise known as Serial Solutions. Are there plans to submit more of these digitized records to these discovery services, such as Summon? Absolutely. In fact, it's a good question because we are already there. All of our electronic resource records have been submitted to the major discovery services, including Summon, Primo, EBSCO, and WorldCat management. So our records are available to be activated by your institutions themselves. All you need to do is select those things to be brought into your discovery services, and we highly encourage that you do that. CRL continually updates its records through those systems, so those records are automatically updated in the discovery services. It's a good alternative to record loading, although I would like to stress, though, that we find that the discovery services don't always surface CRL's records as prominently as we would like when doing those searches. And the solution that we've seen time and time again that really helps bring those to the top of the searches by your patrons is if you also load those records locally into your system, and to create a pathway showing that these are online at a particular URL that your patrons can access. I believe I'm out of time, but I would be happy to take your questions afterwards and respond to them as I can.